Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll give just a few moments for folks to come in, hop off other meetings, and join us before kicking things off.
When did I put on the song?
The song is always welcome, Thad.
Realm of words, where dreams take flight. AI stands ready, a guiding light. Whispers of wisdom, it sparks the mind. Unveiling ideas, both rare and refined. It sits through the chaos and happens anew. Crafting rich plots and characters too. With dialogue's rhythm, the setting so grand. AI lends a hand like a trusted friend. So
Well, thank you so much for that, Thad.
Thank you.
Everyone, I'm delighted to welcome our audience to AI in the Slush Pile, Transforming Manuscript Evaluation and Onboarding. This is the first in our series for 2025. We have 8 webinars, including this one planned for the year, so lots of exciting content coming up. My name is Berrett-Koehler. I'm Operations Manager for the Book Industry Study Group. I'm also one of the leaders for BISG's AI Working Group, where we discuss how AI is impacting and influencing the book industry from a supply chain perspective. Thad has been working with BISG for quite a long time now. We've done some phenomenal programs together, so we're delighted to welcome him back. Thank you so much, Thad.
Thank you, Brooke. It's wonderful to be here for the 7th in our series, which delights me, and the first of 8 that are planned for this year. So that should be very good. I'm also particularly delighted to be kicking off the year with this event, the AI in the Slush Pile. When we started talking about this last year, we were thinking, this is in some ways right at the core of the sensitivity and the glamour and the grandeur of publishing is this mythical slush pile that we're going to look at today. And we're going to look at the applicability of some AI tools to the slush pile. So there's going to be a dynamic intersection. We've got 3 wonderful speakers. I've got them in reverse order of how we'll be hearing from them today. You see them on the screen. Jeevan Sivasubramaniam, who is with Berrett-Koehler Publishers, then Regina Brooks, who has her own Serendipity Literary Agency in New York, and will bring the agent's perspective, and then bringing in an overview with an agent's lens is Laura McGrath, who's, as well be explaining to you, an author who has studied agenting in depth, and so brings her own scholarly perspective to this. What we're doing something different this year. And what we're doing is inviting sponsors to be part of each event and to cover some of our costs in presenting the series. And so here today, for the first time, we've got 2 great sponsors, and I just want to introduce them. I hope you'll sit by for the commercial break. First sponsor, alphabetically, of the 2 is R. Bowker. You know Bowker well if you've been in the book business for more than a week. Bowker's at the heart of things with a great many services. I put up a slide, talking about all the different ways that they service our industry, whether for authors, for publishers, resellers. Of course, books in print is their signature service, but they've expanded from that to a great many other services as well. And Quantifiction is a software program that we'll be talking about today. And I've got a little commercial, a video that they prepared for this event. It's 30 seconds.
At Quantifiction, we augment human creativity with AI to transform fiction publishing. Iris uses precise data insights for intelligent manuscript assessments. For publishers, it detects standout manuscripts in minutes. For authors, it provides insights for compelling, market-ready stories. Iris uses 5 metrics and 30+ AI benchmarks to evaluate manuscripts. Join thousands of authors and publishers. Visit us today.
So thank you to Bowker and Quantifiction, and we'll be looking at Quantifiction a little later in the program today. AI in the slush pile, here we go. The previous webinars are now all available on YouTube. Thank you, Brooke, for getting them posted. So you can get the sense of the continuity of what brings us here today. We started off last year. May, can AI be detected in writing? A hot button topic as well. Another subject we waded into was in June, looking at book translation. In September, we had a panel considering the content licensing that's going on with a lot of different book publishers. In October, we get more of a tool oriented type of session with AI and editorial, followed in November by AI and workflow. December, we had a wonderful author panel looking at AI and poetry, and that was fun, and that video's online. I have to recommend that one as well. So today our three speakers, here's the order in which we'll be talking to them. We'll be starting with Laura, going to Regina, and then Jeevan. So invariably, I put up a bit about me. I'm very bored with this particular slide, but I'm so mindful that there are some people here today that might not have encountered my work. So bear with me if you've seen this before. My focus has always been where publishing and technology intersect. And that's been what's driven my work for several decades now. As it turned out, when I look back in the files, I started studying AI in '87, but back then it really had no applicability to book publishing. It came back into focus around 2015, and I started studying the opportunities there and the startups that were purporting to bring AI into the publishing community. But again, nothing strong. Several of those companies went out of business. Then comes fall 2022. I was putting that in the slide last night and thinking 2022, surely that was 2023. Nope, we're already, going into several years of this technology, and yet it feels in some ways like we're just getting started. I cover AI as part of covering publishing innovation for Publishers Weekly. I managed to self-publish a book last summer, The AI Revolution in Book Publishing, which is available in all the usual suspects as part of many other books that I've published over the years. Enough about me. When I talk about AI, I've done this also in other programs, but I always feel it's worth coming back to is, there's a presumption, of course, because we're running a program to look at some of these tools, that, it's this unabashed fanboy AI time, and it's not that at all. And I feel it's impossible to talk about AI in the publishing industry or elsewhere without addressing the threats and concerns. And I use this chart, which is even missing a couple of topics, but I maintain a whole research folder on the threats and concerns that face us surrounding AI. And this is a list of many of them. I'm signaling focusing on copyright here today, because of course that's very much at the forefront whenever we start talking about the use of creative work in the publishing industry, and this feeling that the sense that has essentially been proven but not put anyone in jail, that a great many works that were in copyright were ingested into these AI engines, and that's unfortunate, isn't it? I call it the original sin. It's something that clouds, any kind of discussion that we can have around chat AI or any of the, large language models. The use of this technology is the fact that this, cloud is hanging over the technology and the whole AI industry, and unmistakably it is. We have to be cognizant of that. Yeah, so I feel that people can judge AI harshly and can indeed make a decision to actually abstain. As we're about to move forward in this webinar talking about its utility, I also consider it that anyone who says, no, I've looked at this, I've looked at what it can do, what it can't do, and the concerns that surround it, particularly in these fraught times, and have made a decision not to have AI be part of my toolkit. Perfectly legit. Quite understandable decision. That being said, we come into the program today that we'll be talking, amongst other things, about the ethics and the transparency of the use of this technology. I put this slide up there because when I was reviewing what I'd promised to cover today, this was amongst the topics, was to look at these ethical implications of AI assisted review. Now, I'm putting it up here now as a sort of heads up. We'll come back to it after we've talked through the topics, yes, and then I also want to show you the software, some of the key software, and look at what the ethical considerations would be around the use of that software, and also security concerns, which I will come back to as well. When I talk about AI within the book publishing industry, I come back to and kind of an old chestnut. When we evaluate any new technology, the questions that sort of the easy but very important question that has to be asked is, if I use this technology, will I be able to do this kind of work, whatever that is? Will I be able to do it faster? Will I be able to do it cheaper? Will I be able to do it better? And as the illustration on the slide shows, the kind of the wisdom of this paradigm is that you can't have all three. You can have better and faster, you can have cheaper and better, etc., but you cannot have all three. And I believe that with AI, the necessity is to set the goal that you're looking for all three. Of course, AI tools are going to be faster. We're seeing that unequivocally. Cheaper, yes, although much of the cheaper comes from a reduction in labor cost, and that has its own implications. But yes, cheaper, then better. Virtually all of the scuttlebutt around AI is that no, it's not as good as, nowhere near as good as, hallucinates, makes all kinds of mistakes. All true. But the goal, I put it to you, is that if you look at a technology such as what we're going to look at today, one of your goals has to be, I will only take this on if I also feel I can do the work better than I could without the tool. I want it faster, I want it cheaper, I want it better. I hate slides with this many lines on it, so I apologize, but I could have split it up into two slides, but instead let's go through it really quickly, just as a positioning for the discussion today. First, I referenced the romance of slush pile discovery, and I think a lot about that. I was thinking a lot about it as we were preparing, and in my conversations with our panelists up front. And it underlies this whole consideration. There's a mythology around the whole slush pile, and amazing books being discovered in the slush pile. I'm going to do a slide of a couple of the books that were, several authors that were discovered in the slush pile. And so we've got this conception of the kind of sanctity of the slush pile as the source of genius and breakthrough in the publishing industry, great authors being found in the slush pile. So that's a contextual setting for any discussion like this. Then the other thing we'll be looking at today is the difference between agents and book publishers vis-a-vis the slush pile. In some ways, it's very much the same on both sides. In other significant ways, it's quite different. Also, a question is, what percentage of the books that get published are actually coming through the slush pile? It's interesting to think of the slush pile in those terms, because clearly it's not a majority of the books. Also, fiction versus nonfiction. And this will come up when Jeevan and I are talking, because Berrett-Koehler is a nonfiction book publisher, yet some of these tools are clearly better suited or mainly suited to fiction. So that's in our background discussion. And then, what exactly the software tools that I'll be showing you after the discussion, we're going to go through our chat, and then I'll come over to the software demo. With these tools, is the challenge to just manage the slush pile or actually filter out work within the slush pile? We'll be looking at whether or not there's a possibility for auto rejection button and what the implications of that are, and which software then can help with this task. Now, you've heard of some of these people in the context of slush piles before. It's sort of apocryphal stories that the Twilight series originated in the slush pile. I thought they'd found it on a fan fiction site, but no, apparently it originated in the slush pile. One of Rowling's books was in an agent's slush pile, the first Harry Potter, and then her subsequent mystery pseudonymously published, I think that ended up in another publisher's slush pile. etc. And so, when you think about these authors and their success, and then think, oh, if someone hadn't been paying attention to the slush pile, we might never have, gotten Philip Roth or, heard from Stephanie Meyer. So that little cloud looms over all of this. And now we'll move over to talking specifically with our panelists. Our first panelist, Laura McGrath, I guess we started talking maybe a year ago when we first connected, and I had a chance to read her marvelous article, Literary Agency. And there's a link. We'll be sending out these slides, but it's available, online for purchase, and will be the basis of Laura's new book. And so I thought it would be great to have Laura come and join us today and talk about agenting in broad strokes and the slush pile before we start talking with Regina, who's living this stuff day to day. So welcome, Laura. I'll stop the slides here.
Thank you so much, Thad. And I have to say, it is a bit nerve-wracking to be speaking before Regina, who can fact check me in real time, I suppose. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so appreciative of you, Thad, and the invitation to be here with you today. I do want to issue a brief apology before I begin, which is that about 3 feet behind my office door here, my HVAC is being repaired. So I hope that this will be a quiet process, at least.
So far, so good.
Good. So Thad asked me to come talk a little bit about the slush pile from the perspective of my research. I'm writing a book on the social and cultural history of literary agents in the United States for Princeton University Press, supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. The book's one part history and one part anthropology. So looks at the careers of significant literary agents in the 20th century, but then also involves hours and hours and hours of field work and interviews and going to parties and lunches and the Frankfurt Book Fair, and my take as an outsider on how agents work and what they do and why. The slush pile is really the center of many of these myths that aspiring writers in particular have about literary agents. It's, as Thad was describing earlier, the sort of source of so much publishing industry romance. If you are spending any time reading Publishers Weekly or Poets and Writers or even New York Times book coverage, you will find these Cinderella stories of writers who were found in the unlikeliest of places. That is, writers who did not have connections or friends to introduce them to agents, writers who were not coming from top flight MFA programs, writers who did not grow up in a family of writers, but simply by hook and by crook and raw talent found their way into an agent's hands by virtue of this blind submission process. So it's, Courtney Cox getting pulled up on stage at the Bruce Springsteen concert for a writer. For an agent, it's about the thrill of the find. It's about the discovery of talent that is part of what makes literary agents decide to choose this path. It's about finding that needle in a haystack that attests to the value of an individual's taste and an individual's eye, which I think makes these conversations around AI and the slush pile especially vexed and challenging as we think about what it might mean to perhaps offboard or offload some of those responsibilities from a reading individual who is well-trained and well-schooled. And for the publishing industry broadly, I think the slush pile is this sort of myth of meritocracy that gets maintained, right? That truly anyone could make it. You do not need the Iowa MFA, or you do not need the New Yorker essay. You could make it via the slush pile. Note that I said the myth of meritocracy, but it is the idea, nonetheless, that keeps the slush pile a vibrant and overflowing source in many agencies and kind of hopeful location for writers.
Well, let me drop for a second here. You and I had talked about, I'm not sure if this is in your notes for today, but the history of slush. Where did slush enter our industry?
Sure. I can speak at least from the agent's perspective, which is that the first literary agent entered onto the field in the United States in the 1890s. And initially, the agent's work was primarily about placing magazines. A magazine economy was what was central to the agent's work when they first began in the US, in part because international copyright laws were not robust. There were not necessarily book rights to be bought and sold. And so you would have authors writing from the far west in the United States, from the Midwest, who did not have the context in New York to be placing their magazines in, or placing their stories in magazines. And so they would work with agents who had all of these connections, who had access, who knew where and who to send a piece to. And so Slush began in those early ages. For as long as there have been agents, there have been slush piles. And I'm certain the same is true with editors. For as long as there have been editors and publishing houses, there have been slush piles.
One of the things I wasn't able to find was the use of when did the term first get into currency? Do
You know, that's a good question. I don't know the use of the term. I don't know the use of the term, but
It's so derogatory.
do you know, Jeevan?
But you should go ahead. I'll just.
Oh, no, I mean, I'm curious if you know the answer. I'd love to
Oh,
hear.
no, I don't know exactly when the term came into usage, but it's slush is essentially, when snow begins melting and it's messy and hard to navigate and it has no form and it just kind of sits there. And so they started applying that term,
Makes sense.
this
That
pile.
is derogatory.
It is. It is.
And I mean, pile, of course, was once very literal, an actual pile of manuscripts that had come through the mail.
And that's one of the things we talked about was, the big transition from printed manuscripts to digital and how that's impacted the slush pile.
Oh,
Right.
significantly increased the numbers, that's for sure.
And I do have some numbers to talk about. I can.
Okay.
So the slush pile, of course, is something to get, discovered from, and you don't want your fate consigned there. Like, it's not great to end up there. That's not how authors want to be submitting their work. And so there's lots of different ways that authors have tried to game the system. As any information vacuum, it creates the opportunity for people to try to hack or game or figure out how they might escape this fate, and has introduced, of course, lots and lots of scammers, including one of the first literary agents in the United States to start the auction was a bit of a scammer on the side, for instance, because of the way that he used the slush pile. But that's a conversation for another day. So for the writer, the slush pile represents an access problem. How do I get access to this first gatekeeper who can get my work into the hands of the people that can do something with it? There are, according to our best data, which is incomplete, around 1,500 literary agents in the United States. So let's say you've got 1,500 slush piles. You don't, not all agents are actually reading their slush piles, but for the sake of argument, let's say that's what you've got access to if you're a writer. In a 2012 article that was published on the Millions and Poets and Writers, Scott Hoffman, the founder of Folio Literary, estimated that for every author that he takes from the slush pile annually, he rejects about 11,000. Is fairly staggering. So at Folio, he estimated in 2012, they were receiving about 100,000 manuscripts via the slush pile every year. So if we take that 100,000 multiplied by our 1,500, again, these are dramatically estimated numbers, we're talking about 16,500,000 rejected slush pile manuscripts each year. Not unique manuscripts, of course, no writer worth their salt would submit to only one slush pile, but still, we can talk about the volume of the slush pile. We can talk about how dramatically it's increased from hard copies to digital copies, and I still don't think we can begin to wrap our minds around the magnitude of 16 million rejections each year.
That certainly does set a stage for the software we'll be talking about, because this is, I had not imagined numbers that large, and you start to think, well, maybe there would be a way to use technology to tame this beast.
Absolutely.
That was in 2012. We're now in 25, which is even higher.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So while the writer might see the slush pile as an access problem. For an agent, it is a volume problem. Like there is simply no way to begin to address that volume. So I should say, from the outset here, I consider myself an AI agnostic. I am one of these weird people who is both a data scientist and an English professor. There are a few of us in the world. There are not many. As such, I'm not an AI enthusiast. I'm also not a doomsayer. I like to think about AI less as artificial intelligence, which suggests a replacement of human labor, and instead something closer to augmented intelligence, which is a way of extending our abilities and a way of extending our reach. If you think about that in context of 16 million, there is just simply no way that we could begin to staff an army of assistants that could address that sort of volume. An augmentation of intelligence, which AI can provide for us in different ways, becomes just fundamentally necessary to begin to work through that amount of material.
Laura, let's pause there. That's a wonderful statement on the AI transition from what you pointed out. I want to go to Regina for a few minutes first, or next rather, and talk about the situation from her perspective. Regina, we're going to talk about the software in a few minutes, so we can come back to where, how you feel the software may have applicability. But talk first just about the work you're doing about your agency. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm trying to get myself off mute.
Okay.
As mentioned, my agency is Serendipity Literary Agency. We started in 2000, so we're 25 years old. And I have definitely seen the transition of submissions coming to me. When I first started, and I was kind of on the cusp of the end of the brick and mortar, actually sending paper, but we still were actually sending some manuscripts through, not electronically, but through the mail. And especially I also represent illustrators, and illustrators were certainly still walking their portfolios around to art directors. So the numbers that Laura talked about are definitely accurate. She mentioned in 2012 about 11,000 submissions. I would say that's pretty much where I am at this point. In fact, there are times throughout the year where we have to just stop taking in submissions. And we were trying to figure out different strategies for handling the influx. I did a thing, I would do submission Saturdays. So we would have people submit on Saturdays only throughout the month, just because we could not handle all of the influx of submissions. And again, agents are always trying to figure out ways to make this work. And we oftentimes work with interns, assistants, and junior agents, and they're looking through the slush. And, they're looking at it with gut instinct, and also trying to get a feel for understanding the market trends and the storytelling and how these things might factor into what an agent might be actually interested in. And so the thing about AI that I think is helpful is by automating this process. And I love the way you mentioned it, Laura, talking about it being an augmenter and not a replacement. When manuscripts are sent to us, they use this screening using natural language processing, and they call it NLP. And NLP enables computers to understand, interpret, and generate human language. And it combines linguistics, machine learning, and data science to analyze text and speech in a way that mimics human comprehension. And so when people send in a query letter to me, and I think, honestly, if people start to use this, especially in the software that I've started to play around with, the query letter might go away, or a portion of the query letter might go away. People spend hours, they have lots of courses on how to write the perfect query letter for your manuscript. And I will tell you that oftentimes that is one of the most challenging things for writers to actually come up with. They're really good at writing their manuscript, but then when they have to talk about the manuscript in a query letter, they kind of get stumped. But the AI powered query letter analysis, I think, is going to be a godsend. And the other thing is, like, when you look at all the different ways that agents ask authors to submit their work, some want a query letter in the first 50 pages, some want a query letter in the first 3 chapters, some want the query letter and the full manuscript. And so with agents, what people are being asked to send along is different across the board. And some agents and publishers who are experimenting with these tools, especially one of the ones that I had a chance to actually dive into, it goes directly into the manuscript. And so you're looking at the manuscript, and the manuscript is being analyzed for writing style. It compares it to successful books that have already been published. It scans it for overused tropes, pacing issues, any structural weaknesses. I mean, it really does some of the work of an editor's eye immediately.
Let me interrupt if I may. Yeah, I'm going to demo a little bit of this in a few minutes. So I'll be able to give them some screen sense of what you're describing. And then we can come back to that and talk more about how you see might be applicable to the work that you're doing. Let's go over to Jeevan and get a book publisher's perspective. It's interesting that this topic really has to look at the wider sort of ecosphere. Agents in some ways are filters into the publishing industry, but we're also can't lose sight of the fact that there's could be 10,000 book publishers in the States that still take some slush in, still take in some unsolicited manuscripts. So going over to Jeevan, can you just describe a little bit about Berrett-Koehler for those who don't know the company and the kind of books that you publish? On mute. Oh, gotta unmute you, Jeevan.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
4 years and still an industry. Yes, Berrett-Koehler has been around since the early 90s. Our founder was the publisher at Josie Bass Wiley, and we're independent. We're distributed by Penguin Random House globally, and we specialize mainly in business management, economics, as well as current affairs and personal growth. That's yeah.
Great. When we talked before this session, when we talked last week, you had a really interesting perspective on the slush pile as something that you're able to use to competitive advantage.
Yeah, all the editors and everyone else in the company mocks me for it. I'm kind of a bleeding heart when it comes to this. I always think if an author, makes the time and really puts together a proposal and crafts it, that they deserve the attention and response. And so I've always, from day one, always said, like I've told the assistants back in the days, you call the author. If they went to the trouble and everything, you call them to reject them. Don't email them, or the agent. But what happened, I would love to take credit for this, but I'm not nearly smart enough. What happened is we started to realize that a lot of these authors were so grateful for that personal connection and actually explaining why a book doesn't work instead of saying not what we're looking for at this time, etc., that they remembered us, and they would refer, even if they were rejected by us, they would have other authors they'd meet who they would refer on to us. And it is a surprising number of our authors came to us through other rejected authors. But, we're not a major publisher. We can't compete with the big boys. All we have is our reputation and the way in which we conduct ourselves with authors and a more equitable balance. And
I noticed when we were talking last week as well that you highlighted your proposal guidelines on your website and had a chance to look at those. And it seems in a sense to be one way to try and enhance the slush pile, you might say, by giving very clear instructions to authors as to how they should structure their proposals to Berrett-Koehler.
Yes, and I'd say 3 out of 10 authors actually follow.
Right. And the other thing you talked about was for Berrett-Koehler, it's much more about the author than about the manuscript per se, that you start with the author and the author's platform. And when you and I were talking about, what kind of software might be most valuable for the fiction publisher, it's very different than for the nonfiction publisher such as Berrett-Koehler.
Yes, we are very hands-on editorially, which I know is a bit of a fading thing these days. I know a lot of traditional publishers also I've heard and all spoken to where they have such volume that they can't really focus hands-on and editorially really shaping a book from the ground up. But that is our competitive advantage. And so much really depends on, when I look at a proposal, I hate to admit this, I go straight to, is the subject range in generally within what we do? Yes. Okay. Go see who the author is and what kind of presence they currently have, because everything else can be built and rebuilt if the author is amenable to that and restructured. So an AI spitting out the content and approach of a book is not that helpful. If I was to have AI, selfishly enough, it would just pop up. This is how often they speak. This is their social media. This is the rest we can work with. So
when you said that, I thought of the software that I'm going to show people now. None of them do that, and yet it's not a unreasonable or undoable request. But let me demo some of the software and give people an idea of what's available today. So I'll go back into.
Can I just say something?
Absolutely.
It's so funny because when I first started agenting, part of I thought my secret sauce and specialty was the fact that I'd never sent a canned rejection, that you would get some kind of feedback on your material. But as the volume and over the years, as the more authors that I started to get sending me projects, it was impossible to keep up with that. And like you, I also love to see who the author is, because oftentimes I would tell you probably about 60% of the people who send me proposals, especially on the nonfiction side, I end up tweaking their concept or tweaking their idea to make it saleable and commercially viable. And that AI is not equipped at least from what I've seen, to be able to identify authors and help agents figure out how to make that part of the process happen.
So we'll put that on the wish list for the next version of some of this software that we'll look at now.
Well, one thing, Thad, just to keep in mind, this has been my experience. I don't know about you all, but the authors who are most established often send the crappiest proposals.
Yes. Yes.
So if you have AI looking for certain things, it's going to crash and burn with the highest potential authors often.
I think you are absolutely right.
That's wonderful. I've never heard that said before. Thank you. So the software, when I set out to figure out what might be applicable to the task at hand, I went to the database. You'll see a URL there. Again, we'll send these slides out to you. But I maintain a database of all of the startups in the book publishing industry that are using technology to solve publishing challenges. I've got over 300 of them in my database that use AI to enable some portion of it. When I looked at the slush pile, I was able to identify 11 vendors who have some applicability in the tools that they're offering, but I'm going to focus in on just a few of those. The first one I want to start with is Authors AI. They're about a 4-year-old, maybe 5-year-old company now. And I start with them because they represent a trend within some of this software, which is to use natural language processing to assess the quality of the manuscript itself. And when you go to the websites of the software companies that use these kind of tools, you'll see a lot of charts like what's on the screen of, peaks and valleys in narrative time and, characteristics of the major characters within the plot. And there are these kind of quantitative or, non-qualitative, but rather quantitative assessments that come out of these analyses. And it remains a question mark for me as to what the real value of these is. It's something Laura, I know, has gone deeply into as well. But at any rate, throwing that out onto the table. And so when you come to quantifiction, they base their tool in part on this kind of NLP analysis, and you end up with a dashboard such as you're seeing there, where they translate the NLP analysis into saleability. They come up with an overall rating, style fit against the styles that your company currently publishes in, genre fit, and so on and so on. You end up with this number, in this case 61, and a certain degree of likelihood as a result that the book might be a bestseller, which is an audacious and intriguing claim. Going forward, they made an alliance with a German company last year named My Pulitzer. Awkward sort of name. He said it was, in fact, partly a play on Pulitzer. At any rate, with that, you have a secondary tool which allows you to organize the slush pile, just to sort it, register it, and then before moving it, forward into the quantification tool. Aquistry is another company out of the UK, and they take an approach which again will lead into the final software that I'll show you. The idea in Aquistry and the next one is that you, rather than saying, I'm open to publishing any old thing that might have, some amazing potential, in Aquistry, you tell it what you currently publish by topic, even by these kind of NLP factors of, emotional style, empathy, sentiment, and so on. You'll upload a series of the fiction books that you've published. It will analyze those and try and match submissions, against that kind of analysis, which, again, it's intriguing. It sounds very promising. I'm not sure in the real world just how workable that would be. There's one of their control panels. So going from there, perhaps the most intriguing of the startups is Storywise, who are combining sort of a range of tools, but they don't include the natural language processing ability of the other software, which is, feature or drawback. They have fairly sophisticated ways for authors or for agents or for publishers to set out what their requirements are and to be able to match against the requirements that you've preset for the software in terms of the manuscripts you're trying to attract. They control also the logistics of the whole process and can automatically forward submissions into folders and that sort of thing, so they can make just that part of the workflow more efficient. And this, that I referenced at the beginning, you have the possibility of the auto decline of having the software under certain conditions send the manuscripts right back without any kind of human intervention. Of course, with a note saying we read with, I highlighted that, we read with interest, your manuscript, or rather our machine did, and our machine is sorry to disappoint you. So that is a possibility with the software. So there's enough of that for the time being, and we'll get out of screen sharing. And we are at 10:44, which does open up the possibility of Brooke giving us the beginning of Q&A. During the Q&A, please, all of you feel welcome to riff, to go down alleys, and also to answer the questions when possible.
Thank you, Thad. We do have some questions that have come in. If anyone's not monitoring the chat, I do just want to note that we are very much welcoming questions. Please drop them in the Q&A to be answered live. If we do run out of time, those questions will be sent to all of the panelists, and then we will include that in the slide deck recording email that's distributed out. So if you have a question, it will get answered. So please do drop it in that Q&A. Our first question is from an anonymous attendee. For those who are using tools to evaluate manuscripts, are you also considering the security of those systems and whether they are able of holding the manuscript securely? Do your authors worry about unpublished manuscripts floating around on the internet? From a purely technical perspective, how are we feeling about this?
I'm going to start with that one, Regina. You may have a different view on it. I meant to actually put that up front in the slides because every time I talk to audiences of authors or anyone working in publishing around any AI tools, there's a deep suspicion and fear that in using the tool, the work is somehow subsumed as some of the other previous copyright work has been subsumed, and that that your work will somehow leak out into the AI ecosphere. The concern is an important one, but all of the software has now put into place fairly rigid security procedures to prevent exactly that, knowing that if they did have that kind of flaw in the software, that the thing wouldn't be usable by anyone in the publishing industry. We're not going to take those kind of risks. So, the takeaway, yes, a good concern, but you can be pretty much certain, double check that the software does have very good security features. Regina?
And I will just say, I have not, my agency has not used AI tools to do selection of authors at this point. I'm exploring to see whether or not this is something that our agency could tap into, but we have not used them. And from the companies that I have explored, the manuscripts do not become a part of like LLMs or LMMs. So you don't have to worry about that. It's immediately deleted. It's not like, social media, once it's up, it's up somewhere, even if it's deleted. It's not like that.
Yeah, that's good.
Great. Thank you both. Jane has a very similar question, kind of adding on to that. How can we make authors feel more comfortable about AI as part of this process without fearing that their rights and material will be infringed upon in some way?
Who wants to take that one? Given that I'm the biggest advocate here at the party, I'll start again. Anyone else, please join in.
Similar answer.
Yeah, my answer would only be it's hopeless at this point. You can't. Their anxieties are through the roof, understandably, and the only way for them to calm down is to get closer, more exposure to the technology. I don't know if others, feel differently about that.
I have one piece of advice I always tell authors. This is not directly related to AI, but it is. A lot of authors contact me and they're like, well, I don't want somebody else to steal my idea. I don't want to, and I said, the best way to protect your idea is to publicize it. Start writing articles about it right now. Start writing blogs. Start being known for it, because while you're sitting here carefully protecting your manuscript, somebody else is writing about the same thing and publishing it publicly. And guess what? When your book comes out, people are going to think you took it from them.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you there.
Great advice.
Great. This one's for Regina. Can you share some specific tools that you're using to get that pacing, especially around trope identification and that type of work?
I'm not using any tools at this point, but I am exploring them to help with that, because again, we get so many submissions and I have to train my assistants and my interns and the people who are helping me to actually manage all of this. I have to train them on what is needed and what I'd like to see in a manuscript. And if there are tools out there that can help with that training process, I would love to be able to tap into them. But at this point, I have not.
Let me move the question over to Laura. I sort of downplayed the value of these NLP, natural language processing analyses of manuscripts. What's your perspective on the validity or utility of these approaches?
For NLP, I mean, what I think is really useful about this, a few ways of framing this usefully. I mean, one of this is thinking about NLP as an extension of what we can already do, as it begins to codify the things that are valuable to us. I think, AI is often really scary to people and really scary to authors because we're thinking about this in sort of the Isaac Asimov space, which is not to say the space of saying, all of the outputs that you could possibly get are dependent on the inputs that you are looking for. AI is simply a tool. NLP is simply a tool. And so NLP is not magically deciphering literature for you or determining what's valuable or what's good about a book. It's simply operationalizing and making very literal the things that you already value as a reader. Authors AI or these other tools that you showed us, that, I mean, my interaction with them is that they come out of a literary studies background. It's people that have been working deeply in literature. I know the creator of Authors AI from our work together at the Stanford University Literary Lab. This isn't invented out of nowhere or without attention to a long literary history. Now, how you find that useful is dependent on you and the sorts of ways that you think about your own reading practice and the sorts of things that you value as a reader. But I would say, one good way of this is kind of a left turn from your question, Thad, but one good way of tamping down some of that fear is by emphasizing, like, for as shiny and chrome as all of our language is trying to make AI out to be, these are blunt force instruments. They can only do work that is as good as we make it out to be. And the way that we can employ those tools are only as good as our skill as readers. That's it. It comes back to the inputs and outputs, which are based on you, a human who is reading a book. And so I think that becomes a way of maybe reframing this conversation, that remembering that, like, well, this started in a literary lab, becomes a way of doing that for us.
Can I just add something to that? And this is, I think a number of people are concerned about this, and especially for the kind of projects that I work on, the bias in the AI models. I think that the training data skews towards certain genres and styles and voices, and using them can unintentionally filter out diversity and also innovative writing. So again, it has to be used as a tool, because I would have to put in what kind of things I'm looking for. And I can tell you that some of the best writing, and one of the things that makes being an agent really exciting is the curiosity of finding something new and fresh. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have the right kind of inputs, as Laura's saying, if you don't have the right kind of inputs, you're automatically probably going to be getting formulaic type of responses.
Thank you, Regina. That's actually very timely, because we have another question that goes on at some length, but kind of abbreviating that. This anonymous person says, we have numerous fine works of literature that use unconventional or unusual writing voices and experimental structures. Are there ways that AI screening tools account for this, or do they operate more on a law of averages? So how are we making sure that these unconventional and unique voices and structures are recognized?
Laura, could you take that as someone who's worked with the technology? When I talked to your colleague Ted Underwood at one point, he said, "Oh yeah, that's called literariness."
Yeah. Which doesn't seem like the most technical of measurements that we could possibly find. I mean, it's really hard. I think about this example, I think about someone like Gertrude Stein. And this is something that the writer Ben Marcus has talked a lot about when he thinks about readability and what makes Gertrude Stein Gertrude Stein. This is like the repetition of 5 words over 20 pages that is innovative in its own right. I think this question is an important one. It's a really good one. It's really useful to think about how AI can only then help us in addition to the sorts of reading that we're going to do. I also think it's really important to remember the context and structures in which these tools are getting used, to think about them in relationship to the different sorts of structures that we value within the context of publishing, right? You do still value that information that you find about an author that you were talking about, Regina and Jeevan, right? That's still being read oftentimes in addition to this work. I think the fear is the sort of auto-reject around AI, if I can read into this question a little bit, the idea that like the Fleisch readability level is so low, so obviously this must be bad, so let's reject it outright. That certainly would be your prerogative to use AI that way. It doesn't sound, Regina, like that's particularly the way that you're using these tools. But that, you know, if you're getting in a work from someone who is, you know, perhaps not exactly the most innovative or is a really new and novel and challenging way of thinking about literature, but also has a really well-written query letter, a really thoughtful way of talking about why they're querying you as an individual, what they like about your list, why they could see themselves as your client. That mismatch, I think, should prompt you to read more or to want to look at that manuscript more, not less, if I am imagining how you might work as a reader. So, you know, the sort of auto submission is, I think, like the laziest possible way to use AI. And my bet is that's not what's happening here, or that's not how an agent like Regina, a very good agent, would ever think about using something like this.
I think also it requires that the author start to understand the tools a little bit themselves, because if an agent is going to use these tools and they're inputting certain words and quote metadata, an author needs to understand what metadata is, you know, and what those words are. It's almost like, you know, when you're applying for a job today and you put your resume up in one of these portals and it's scanning for certain words, you need to know what those words are. And it's kind of this, it's a similar kind of process. I think that as we move forward, and more agents and more editors start to use these software tools, the author is going to, even if they have the best of manuscript, they're going to need to understand metadata. They're going to need to understand how to input certain words, just like they today learn how to write a really great query letter. That process is going to morph a little bit.
Great point.
I also don't mean to downplay the question or dismiss it as not a very valid one. And as someone who's spent a lifetime studying literary history before I got to ever think about data, it's a question that's really important to me. But the odds that you would get James Joyce, the odds that James Joyce would happen to be querying you, would happen to be using this AI tool, that you would happen to get it and reject it. I mean, we're talking about a once in a lifetime, once in a generation writer. This is what we read, right? This is maybe one of 12 writers you're reading on a syllabus in a semester. But when you think about that in relation to the bulk that we're getting here, the odds that that would be your one situation are very, like, astronomically slim. So, you know, again, we're talking about volume.
Yeah.
I think about the book Who Moved My Cheese? That probably would not have been selected through AI.
Yeah.
Well, we do have over 12 questions left and only 2 minutes left, so I'm going to just rapid fire through just a couple things to see if we can get some of these answered. And then the remainder I will send to all of you panelists afterwards so that we can get those answered in a little bit longer format and distributed when we send out the recordings.
Thanks.
Rapid fire for whoever wants to take it. Can these tools interpret diagrams, artwork, or other visuals, or are they only text-based? This is especially relevant for the academic sector and the children's sector.
Text only.
Text only.
This is for Jeevan. Do you currently use any AI-based analysis tools in book production to test if manuscripts are complete, images suitable, that kind of thing?
No, that's me. I am the AI.
Is there any concern that this technology would lead to an even larger influx of submissions like we're seeing in the job market for manuscripts with AI-generated content trying to game the system?
Yes, I can, but I think this is much more of a risk in fiction. because so much in nonfiction depends on who the author is. And established nonfiction authors, they have too much ego to let AI do anything for them. But when it comes to fiction, I do know my the young lady who I work with, who reports to me, she actually is a known published science fiction writer. And she told me that recently several journals have had to shut down submissions because you had people just feeding prompts into AI, letting it spit out a story and then submitting it.
But there
And
are tools that can also detect plagiarism, or if you have been using AI to craft content.
Last question for today, since we are at time. This one is most applicable to Jeevan and Regina. If AI is helping agents and publishers navigate the slush pile better, and you get that time back, what does that unlock for you? What is the benefit here for you?
I would say for me, the opportunity to work with more authors, possibly, also to help authors develop their material more. You know, I feel like a lot of the editorial work that editors, in-house editors, have had to historically do, that now has been placed on the agent to do in order to get the book even purchased. So it gives us more time to develop the author's work.
Jeevan?
I think Regina said it better than I could. Actually devote the time to shape the works that we want to put out.
Wonderful. I think we're at the hour, Brooke.
We are at the hour.
It went so
So-
fast.
Thank our panelists. Thank you, Brooke, as always, for holding this all together. Thank you, Laura, for joining us, for Jeevan, Regina. Wonderful to have you here. Wonderful to kick this topic around, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you
Thank you so much to our
Fun.
panelists. Thank you, Thad, for conceiving of the series and for bringing all of this together. We're so very appreciative.
Thanks.
And just as a reminder for folks, this will be recorded and distributed, and we'll get those questions out to you soon. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.